Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's session on water smart gardening with My Smart Garden. My name's Kat from Hobsons Bay City Council. I'd like to start by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Kulin people have a history of foraging and farming food in a very water smart way for more than 65,000 years, which is a stunning 2,300 or more generations. So it's incredible history we have in this land for how to use water wisely. My Smart Garden, if you found us randomly on the internet, is a 10 council collaboration across the broader Metro Melbourne area. We'd love to help you get more out of your garden spaces, whether it's a small apartment balcony or a little unit garden or rental or a more traditional kind of larger suburban garden. We do this through teaching you about growing food and growing habitat, creating shelter from our harsh climate with trees and vines, and also using water and wisely and preventing wastes and things like that as well. So we do encourage you to check out mysmartgarden.org.au, where you'll find lots of free events and lots of other online resources as well. Tonight, we're really excited to welcome Charlotte Harrison from the fantastic organisation Sustainable Gardening Australia. Charlotte's going to provide you with some notes, and you'll also have the recording as well to follow up this session if you would like. And with that, I might just pass over to you, Charlotte, and let you introduce yourself and take us through tonight's session. We're really excited to hear what you've got to share. Thanks so
Yeah,
much.
perfect. Thank you for that welcome, Kat. So I'll start by sharing my screen. I think I can do it over yours, Kat. We'll see. There we go. Yes, welcome everyone. So we're here tonight to talk all about water-wise gardening. It's quite a big topic. So I'll talk you first through sort of the contents. But as Kat said, I have provided some notes which will be on the My Smart Garden website. So you don't need to take comprehensive notes during the session. And the session's also being recorded. So there's no need to sort of be there scribbling. You can just focus on, the talk and the show. If you have questions as we go through, if you can type them in the chat, and you may want to just introduce yourself as well and tell us where you're from or what your garden's like, that would be really handy too. And we'll stop a couple of times during the session and go through some of those questions. So just type them in as you think of them. Oh, sorry, I'm having trouble getting my slide to go forward. There we go. So I'll just introduce you very briefly to Sustainable Gardening Australia. We're a not-for-profit organisation that does a lot of community education, particularly around Melbourne. So I present some workshops for the My Smart Garden program on the Mornington Peninsula, as well as some other councils and libraries. And we have a newsletter and some social media. So if you're already in the My Smart Garden network and you want a little bit more gardening information, feel free to check out our socials, or the QR code is for our newsletter. Sign up there. And I'll introduce myself. I'm a horticulturalist. That's really important for that session. I'm not a plumber, so there are going to be a couple of things when we get to talking about downpipes and tanks and grey water where I might suggest that you do consult a plumber. And also, importantly, I don't know absolutely every regulation from all of your council areas. So again, there may be some instances where I say you might need to check with your council about whether you need permission to do this or that. So my focus is very much on gardens and plants. That's my true love, and also where my training is. So, tonight, what we're going to do is just start by setting the scene, talking really quickly about some quite big concepts, like global concepts about why water's precious, how it works in our environment, what climate change is going to mean for water, and that will give us kind of the impetus to really value water, and maybe then look at setting a water smart goal in your garden or looking at some design features. We'll do that quickly up front, and then I'm really going to hone in on your garden, and hopefully give you lots of tips and ideas of things that you can implement in your garden to use water more wisely, slow it down, store it, and water really effectively as well. So here's the first big concept, and it really is that although we know that most of the globe, if you look at the surface of the globe, is made up of water, about 70% of the globe, most of that is in oceans and it's salty water. So it's not very useful to us as humans or as gardeners for our plants. The amount of fresh water we have is only about 4%. Quite a bit of that is locked up in glaciers and snow and ice and in other river systems and things. So the amount of water that we have available for all of the life on Earth is actually on land is only about 0.5%. So I guess that just sets the scene saying water is really precious. The next concept you probably recognize from school, primary school or secondary school, and it's the water cycle. And this is how water moves through our landscapes. And there are a couple of really important points here. Water evaporates either off the land or off water bodies. It goes into the air, condenses, falls as rainfall, and then it's either sort of captured on the canopy of trees or it falls into the soil or into waterways. And the important kind of thing about this concept is that water really, its nature is always to be on the move. It's quite difficult actually to get water to stay in one place. As gardeners, we need to intervene in that water cycle to slow water down. The other really kind of mind-blowing thing about the water cycle is that it's a closed system. So the amount of water on Earth is finite. There's no such thing as new water. If, for example, ice glaciers melt, the sea level, there'll be more water in the sea and sea levels will rise. So that's sort of what's happening at the moment. So that, again, makes water really, really precious. The next thing to think about is climate change and how climate change affects water and its availability. And this is from the Victorian government's report on the impacts of climate change. We've already seen decrease in rainfall in Melbourne by about 20 millimetres per decade for the past few decades. So 20 millimetres doesn't seem like a lot. However, that change accumulates over several decades, it means that we're having less and less rainfall overall. Looking forward, unfortunately, we're on sort of the worst case in most climate change models. And what we can see is we're going to get many more very hot days, so about double the number that we currently experience. We're going to get less rainfall overall, and particularly less in the winter months. We're used to Melbourne being a city where we get most of our rainfall over winter. So that's going to be less. However, we're going to see, and we're already seeing, more intense downpours when rain does happen. So particularly in spring and summer. So things are changing. And that means that even if at the moment we're really happy with our water use and water management in our garden, we need to kind of be looking ahead to the future and thinking about what those changes might mean for us. The final concept is a bit of a busy diagram, but I'll go through it quickly. And it's really just the difference between how water falls in an area of natural, bushland or a forest versus how it falls and is carried away in cities. So on the left-hand side of your screen is a forest area, and it's essentially what we saw when we looked at the water cycle. It's water rainfall falling. Some of the water is used by trees, and that's called transpiration when that comes out of the leaves of trees. Some water will be evaporated off the soil surface, but a lot of it, because there is soil that is permeable, will infiltrate down through the soil into our groundwater. And that will just very slowly make its way as runoff into our creeks and river systems. If we contrast that to the urban environment on the right-hand side of your screen, what we have is a lot less vegetation and a lot more hard surfaces. So we have buildings and roads and car parks and lots of paved areas and a lot less chance for water to actually soak into the soil. So what that means is when it does rain, we have less transpiration because we've got less plants around, less evaporation. And where the water may in the past have infiltrated down into the soil, a lot of it now is carried into drains. And that is the way we kind of get water out, stop it flooding our streets. What this does is mean that we have a drier environment, so we have less water in the soil generally. But it also means that all of that water is carried really quickly into our rivers and streams. And that creates a whole lot of problems for the habitat of those rivers and streams. And it also makes the likelihood of localized flooding much more likely, as we have seen in recent years. So one of the things that we can do, I think, as a community in our gardens is to really be aware of having as much permeable surface as possible. And we want to be slowing water down and soaking it up rather than having it rush into our gutters and stormwater system. So as I guess is like a bit of a community goal in terms of water management. Okay, what does all this mean for us as gardeners? What it means is we're looking at having longer and drier summers with more intense heat events. So we need to be prepared in terms of our soil health and probably our plant selection for them to be a lot tougher and more tolerant of dry heat. We're going to get less rain in total, as I said, but more intense rain events, and with the potential for that to cause local flooding. We're also going to get drier and warmer winters and springs. So we've had, we're seeing an earlier and earlier spring. I think in Europe, the latest reports are that spring, and scientists look at like the first flowering of certain species and when birds hatch and things like that to determine when spring starts. Spring's moved about 2 weeks forwards in Europe. In Australia, we don't have that detailed data, but we definitely know, for example, you can plant your tomatoes out now in Melbourne earlier than you used to be able to with quite a bit of confidence. It also means that we're looking at more evaporation from those surfaces. So what are we going to do about this and how are we going to garden in this climate? One really useful thing to do is just to look at how water comes into your garden, how you use it, and then how it leaves your garden. So I've got here the two main ways that water will come into your garden are either through rain or through a tap. They're the two general ways. And then within our patch, we can use water to be watering. We can store some rainwater. We can reuse water, either through a formal grey water system or just like collecting buckets of water from the laundry or the shower. And we can use water as well to really cater to biodiversity, so having ponds and bird baths and things. In terms of how water leaves our patch, some of it will go into the stormwater system, but ideally not all that much. Some of it will go into the sewer, mostly from our household water. And then the two at the bottom, evaporation and transpiration, are probably what we want to encourage a bit more of, particularly transpiration, water being pumped through plants and coming out the leaves, because that sort of water loss is actually quite cooling for our environment and our houses. If we wanted to look at what we can and can't influence, I'll challenge you a little bit and say that we can influence all of those factors, just a little bit or a lot, except for rainfall. Rainfall is the only one that we don't have any control over at all. We can decide whether to turn a tap on or not, or just leave our plants. We can decide to put a garden in where the plants don't need any extra watering at all. They just rely on rainfall. We can decide whether to store water or not, whether to have bird baths. And then to some extent, we can have, for example, more permeable surfaces and garden beds and plants and increase the evaporation and transpiration and decrease the amount of water going into the stormwater. And we can even perhaps divert some water that would go into our sewage system. So it's worth thinking about all of those aspects, and then maybe setting yourself like a bit of a goal. So one goal might be you want to rely more on rainwater and less on tap water. That would probably mean you might plant different plants, more drought tolerant, maybe some more indigenous plants, or it might mean that you need to store the rainfall when it does rain. Within our patch, we might want to just use enough water, make sure we're not wasting any, store as much as possible, and then reuse water where we can. So in terms of within our patch, my water-wise goal is to slow it down and soak it up. I really want to get maximum use of the water that falls onto my garden. I don't want to waste any, and I want to keep it around as long as possible. And then in terms of outflows, you could look at any of those particular factors and decide to reduce the outflow, for example, to your stormwater. So that's kind of a bigger picture goal. But in terms of other things, I've divided this into 6 separate topics. We can look at design decisions you can make, things you can do to help your soil, the plants you can choose, mulching. I've put that as a separate one to soil because it's so important. We can look at water storage or reuse, and then finally water use. And by that, we're going to actually look at watering techniques and what's efficient and what's not efficient in terms of how you're putting water onto your plants. Okay, so I'm going to look at each of these in turn, and hopefully you'll get ideas that you can incorporate into your garden. So I'll start with garden design. And by this, I actually mean design from the start of a garden, but also we're always changing our gardens and adding and subtracting things and making little tweaks here and there. So it may be design elements that you introduce along the way as well. If you are starting a new garden, it's really great if you can think about water from the start. It will make things easier in terms of zoning plants and putting storage and grey water systems and things in. Much easier to have them planned a little bit from the start, even if you don't implement everything all at once. So we suggest you have a water smart goal. So you can see an example there on the right, which is just to reduce the amount of water used without really compromising too much. So maintaining all of the environmental benefits of your garden. To do this, you really need to know your site pretty well. So it's great if you can observe water in your landscape over the seasons. You might have some areas that are particularly scorchingly hot or dry in summer. Similarly, you might have some areas that become a bit waterlogged, particularly in winter. It's really good to know where those areas are because they can help you in your water management, and they can sometimes present some problems that you might want to solve that'll make just growing plants easier. They also, knowing your site also gives you opportunities for whether you do have some chances to make swales or ponds or sinks and things, which I'll talk about in a moment. As I said, it's easier to plan for water tanks and grey water and things from the start. Much easier to do that than to retrofit them, although we'll talk, and it is possible to retrofit all of those things to your existing house too. You might also want to think about using porous paths, and I'll talk about those in a moment. And they would be the sort of paths that instead of having water run all straight off them, they're going to soak in a bit of water. We'll talk about zoning your plants and then also thinking about your microclimates, and I'll explain that in just a minute too. So as I said, if you know your site, you can really look and see if you have areas where water's causing erosion or whether it's causing waterlogging, and that might give you some opportunities to use swales or sinks or a dry creek bed sort of setup in your garden design. And these are all what we call soft landscaping options. So hard landscaping would be things like driveways and paths and retaining walls and raised garden beds. Soft landscaping is landscaping that's to do with the soil and the plants in your garden. And so what you may be able to do is to create a swale. A swale is usually built on or constructed on a piece of sloping land. So if you've got a very flat garden, it's not necessarily an option or not a good option. But what a swale is a ditch. It's dug along the contours, so around the slope, and it essentially captures water rather than the water just running off straight down the hill. And you generally fill that with stones or rocks or maybe some mulch and then plant on, particularly on the downhill side of it. And that will just capture some water. The other thing you can do if you've got a flat block and you've got an area where water is pooling is create what's called a sink. And a sink is essentially just a depression in your garden. So just it can be quite shallow, maybe 10 to 15 centimeters or a little bit deeper. And when it rains, water's going to run into that depression. It may fill up with water. You might see it might look like a pond for a day or two, and then it will slowly sink into your soil. And that's a way of capturing that water. Now, before you go ahead and start digging up your entire garden and adding these, there are a few things you need to consider. So the first thing is you don't want to be flooding your house or your neighbour's house when you do it. You need to make sure that the water is flowing away from buildings, and also that if you've got clay soil, you're not actually creating a problem, which is a waterlogging problem. So if you have a sandy soil, generally that will drain really well and effectively. If you've got a clay soil, it may be that you're creating a bit of waterlogging and you might need to actually have some drainage in to help you and make sure that the water doesn't sit around for too long, and make your soil really, really too boggy to even grow things in. So that's one design idea. The next one, as I said, was permeable paving. So this is really any paving that allows water to soak in to the soil. It might be like the photo at the bottom, just paving stones, but instead of putting them all together and grouting them together, you space them out a little bit and allow gaps where water can get in. It may be using mulch or granitic sand or something as your paths rather than having paved paths. Or you can actually get specialist products like this one here. You can see it looks like a bit of an aggregate concrete, but water, it's actually designed with some channels through it, and water will actually flow through that. So you can have the look and, the practicality of a hard surface with it still being permeable. And generally what this means, you'd put all of these onto a sand layer under them, about 10 centimeters deep of coarse sand. And so they're going to drain really freely, but it essentially will allow more water to run to be captured in your garden rather than going into the stormwater system. And here's an example. This garden is by Emmeline Bowman, STEM Landscape Design, of putting a sink and what we call a dry creek bed into practice. So you can see, I think they've used some grout to have a hard surface on the driveway, but then this goes into quite scattered, almost stepping stones, kind of crazy paving option, with some granitic sand in the middle. And then either side of this path, there are actually some depressions which are sinks, and they act to absorb storm water when it runs. And this garden used to be quite prone to flooding, and apparently the owners used to absolutely dread rain and heavy rain events because they knew they'd come home to a really soggy, horrible garden. And just those few little changes have made the drainage much better there. So that's an example for you. The other thing you can do when you're designing, and you can do this from the start or along the way, is really just to group plants according to their water needs. So we're very used to grouping plants according to sun or shade needs, but you can also look at how much water they use and group plants together. So one example would be having a succulent garden and putting all your succulents in one place, and you know that that garden or garden bed is really not going to need very much water at all. What I would say with this approach is not to limit the water on plants that really need it. So we know that veggies, being annual plants, they're really fast growing and really productive. They do need quite a bit of water. So what I've done in my garden is used wicking beds for the veggie patch. So that's garden beds where you've got a water reservoir under them. And that means that my veggies have water, as much water as they need whenever they need it. But then I've got other garden beds where I've just got native plants. And I watered them really for the first summer after I planted, and now they essentially rely just on rainfall. So what that means is that I'm kind of spoiling my veggies and I don't feel guilty about putting water on them. I know they need it. But I've also got areas of my garden that really don't need much water at all. I guess another example would be that it would be if you're planting out your nature strip, you know that that area is going to be really hard to water. You don't often have a tap or anything on your nature strip. So design that area for really water-wise, drought-tolerant plants. Local indigenous plants are perfect for that. You may have that as your nature strip, and then you might have some more garden beds that you do irrigate inside your garden. So that approach would be called hydrozoning. The other thing I did mention was microclimates, and a microclimate is just a small area within your landscape or garden that has slightly different environmental conditions to others. So if you've got you're on a balcony and your balcony is north facing and it doesn't have any overshadowing, that microclimate is likely to be really hot and sunny and dry. Conversely, if you've got a south facing balcony, that microclimate might be quite shady and hopefully cool in summer. So, in terms of design, one of the things you might want to do is think about having a shadier, cooler microclimate, not only for your own comfort, but this will also decrease the amount of water your plants use if they're in the shade and they're shade loving plants. So, what you would do for that is essentially plant, climbers or shade trees, hedges and fences that essentially give you a little bit more of a sheltered, shady environment. You can also use this approach to cool your house. So you could put a deciduous tree to the north of your house that shades a window in summer, and then in winter it might lose its leaves and let the sun in and the heat in. I've been experimenting with this a little bit at my place, shading windows with scarlet runner beans because they're beans that will grow in summer. They give me a beautiful shade and lovely red flowers, beautiful leaves to look at as well, and then they die down in winter. So that's another option for you. So that's something that you could think about, and it will not only kind of cool your house, but also generally use less water in if you've got that shady microclimate. It tends to be where the humidity is a bit higher as well, and you're not going to lose as much water through evaporation. Okay, so the next subject is soil. And soil is a huge topic. We could spend hours and hours talking about it. So I'm just going to touch on a few tips that might help in terms of water management in your soil. And what we essentially want is a soil that will store water, it'll hold water and make it available to our plants, but not too much. We don't want it to be totally full of water and waterlogged and rotting our plant roots and getting all smelly and things. So ideally, in a healthy soil, we always say that about half of the soil is going to be made up of minerals and organic matter, and then the other half is actually going to be air pockets, and about half of those, so about a quarter of the volume of the soil in total, should be filled with water. If it's just rained, the water amount becomes less. It takes up some of the air pockets. So the amount of air might be, 10 or 15%. The amount of water might increase to 40 or 45. And then in a dry spell, the amount of air will increase and the amount of water will decrease. So it's not something that is going to stay static. It's going to change. But the general principle is we want your soil to act like a bit of a sponge and soak up water, but still have some air and life in it. In terms of doing that, essentially what we always recommend is adding organic matter, and also planting your soil with plants because plants kind of act as the pump that keeps water moving through that soil, and keeps it really healthy. So what are we going to do this? We're going to be adding organic matter. We don't need to dig it in. Adding it on the surface is fine because in your soil, and the image there is an artist's impression. It's not actually what your soil looks like if you dig down. But what you will find is near the surface, there are some lovely worms, millipedes, centipedes, slaters, bugs, beetles, all of those things that are munching and crunching that organic matter and breaking it down into smaller and smaller pieces. And that's all going to help to improve the structure of your soil and increase the amount of water it will hold. The other thing to do is not to dig unless you have to. You want to just keep the soil structure developing nicely on its own. If you do have very heavy clay, then you may need to take some extra action to improve drainage. So that would be things like maybe digging some French drains and filling them with gravel, or even putting some ag pipe in garden beds to just carry excess water away. We tend to have the opposite problem in sandy soils. They tend to drain too well, and become really dry and what we call hydrophobic, so they get a little bit of a crust on the top of them. Organic matter and mulch are the things that will help you improve that. With sandy soils, that organic matter tends to disappear really quickly, and you need to replace it quite often. And that's just to do with the drainage and those nutrients being kind of washed down through the soil all the time. So it might seem like a constant job to be keeping on putting more compost, more mulch, more autumn leaves, all of those things to keep your organic matter levels up. The other thing we recommend is mulch, and I'll talk about that a bit later. Stop using garden chemicals. So you can see just the amount of life that is in your soil, and all garden chemicals have the potential, including artificial fertilizers, to affect the balance of that life, and potentially kill some of the really important organisms that are in there. And then, as I said, grow plants in your soil. There's nothing like plants for improving soil health because the plant roots stop erosion, and they also help support life of all of that soil food web in your soil. We talk a lot about organic matter. What is it and where are you going to get it? So you can really use anything that has been living, is organic matter. But at SGA, we recommend a bit of a difference between what you put on your veggie garden and what you put on a native or Indigenous garden. So for veggie gardens, we'd use homemade compost, and then aged animal manures. So that would be maybe a pelletized version like Dynamic Lifter or Rooster Booster, or an aged chicken manure if you've got chooks. You just want to let it either put it through your compost or let it sit for about 6 to 8 weeks before you use it. Or you can use worm castings, and then sort of straw mulches. However, for your native gardens, what we want to encourage is a lot of fungal growth, and fungus really loves growing on woody things. So we tend to look at things like dead plant material and leaf litter, maybe eucalypt mulch and some bark mulches as organic matter for those sort of gardens. Okay, we might talk about plant choice and then we can stop, and that's a warning for you to start typing in all your questions. We'll have a break and go through some of those. So in terms of plant choice, as I said, you may choose to have a veggie patch, have a rainwater tank or a wicking bed or something efficient and just spoil your plants that way. But I'm going to assume that you also want to have some areas of your garden where you have really low water use plants. So drought tolerant plants that are going to be easy to care for, even if you don't have a lot of, if you're not using a lot of tap water, you're just relying on rainfall. How are you going to find out what those plants are? So I've got a few ideas. The first would be to look on plant labels. Some of them actually say drought tolerant. Some of them might have a water drop system where one drop means drought tolerant and three drops means it needs quite a lot of water. So that's a good place to start. I'm going to give you a little horticulturalist's gripe here, which is if you see the word hardy or you hear that used and talked about in terms of a plant, hardy unfortunately doesn't necessarily mean drought tolerant. In terms of, the world of horticulture, hardy actually means frost tolerant. So it often means a tough plant, but it doesn't necessarily mean drought tolerant. So I would be looking more at the words drought tolerant or dry or low water use. The other thing we can do is find areas of the world that are really hot and dry and find plants from those areas. So those areas, in terms of the plants that we use in Australia, tend to be from around the Mediterranean. A lot of the plants we have, particularly, the herbs we use and some of the tough little wildflowers and ground covers come from that Mediterranean region. South Africa is another area that has really low rainfall, and a lot of those plants are quite tough. So looking there is a good spot. And then the other spot is kind of around California and Mexico, and a surprising number of plants that we grow come from Mexico. I think dahlias and zinnias both come from Mexico. You might know they're plants that, they really don't get going until the weather warms up and gets quite hot and dry. And then, of course, the other big area we can look at is using indigenous plants. And indigenous plants have co-evolved with our environment and with rainfall, with our rainfall levels. So we know that they're going to be suited to our current climate, and they're likely to be okay in our future climate as well, most of them. And they have other benefits too. They always give a great sense of place to our gardens, and they're going to support local biodiversity. So if you're into native bees and butterflies or attracting birds to your garden, Indigenous plants are a really great choice there too. The other thing you can do is just look at the plant itself, and there will be some clues, usually, about whether it's going to be a plant that will cope with a hot, dry kind of environment. So what we see is lots of plants that have really thin, strappy leaves, and the grass-like this one's a lomandra here. Generally, they have a small surface area to their leaves, so it means they don't lose a lot of water out of them. And these plants actually form a little bit of a funnel. So the water runs down the leaves and down into the root system as well, which is a really great kind of evolutionary trait that they have. So that's one thing you can look at, that kind of small leaves. There are some that have really great and interesting evolutionary traits. So I'm not sure if you know of Dianella. It's the flax lily. It's one that you see all around the place. Councils plant them on roundabouts and things, and they've got little blue flowers, kind of purpley blue with 5 petals. And those leaves, if you look at them on a really hot day, the leaves actually all curl inward. And that's to stop the plant losing any water or really the minimal amount of water on those days. So if you look at those leaves on a shady day, they'll be quite flat, the leaves. And then on a hot sunny day, the leaves will all roll inward and actually curl up and kind of protect themselves that way. You can also look at plants with grey leaves or silver leaves. They tend to be reflecting heat. And a lot of those plants also have little tiny fine hairs on the leaves. So if you feel them, they feel a bit felty. And what that does is creates a little tiny layer of kind of humidity that traps a little bit of moisture in there. So again, that stops the plants losing a lot of moisture on a hot day. The other thing you can look at is plants that survive underground, particularly ones that go dormant in summer. So you can look at some really deep-rooted plants. They can be accessing water really deep down in the soil. So a lot of our native grasses have very, very deep root systems. Or you might look at something like a chocolate lily or vanilla lily that flowers, and then once it gets really hot in summer, it dies down, and there's just a bit of a tuber living underground for the rest of the year. And then the final group, of course, is succulents. And succulents, as we know, they have a different like photosynthetic pathway, but most importantly, they store water in their leaves. And the leaves tend to be really tough and leathery. So you can also look at, the plant itself and kind of make a bit of an assessment as to whether it's going to be drought tolerant or not. In terms of lawns, lawns can be really big users of water, particularly if you want, a kind of show lawn, or you want to have the best lawn in the street, or play golf on your lawn. And you would essentially be using a lot of water over the summer months to keep those types of lawns looking absolutely, special, I guess. So if you're looking at reducing that amount of water, one thing would be to use a drought hardy or drought tolerant species. And these tend to be the ones that are summer growing. So buffalo would be the main type, or kikuyu. And those ones can use up to 70% less water. They tend to have broader leaves, and they have rhizomes. So the whole plant itself is a little bit bigger and tougher. And so that would be one thing you could do. If you already have a lawn though, and you don't want to replace the species, just leaving that lawn longer, not cutting it really short, will help. So generally, what we say is if you've got a taller grass on the top, it will have a deeper root system underneath. By constantly cutting it really, really short, you're sort of limiting the roots to being at the surface. And then on a hot day, of course, they're going to really dry out and not be able to get water. The other thing you can do is use what we call a mulching mower. And these are mowers where instead of having a grass catcher on the back, they've got a really, really fine mulcher, and they get the grass clippings, chop them all up into tiny, tiny bits, and then put them back onto your lawn. So what you're doing there is adding organic matter every time you mow. And then the other thing we'd say is just to water deeply and less often, again, to encourage that deep root system, rather than watering a tiny bit each day. And again, that's just so that you don't get all the roots on the surface. Of course, a fantastic waterways wise thing is to reduce your lawn size, replace that with some lovely garden beds, or to get rid of your lawn altogether. That will save you a bit of water. And another option is really to replace your lawn with a native species. So weeping grass is one of the main ones that's used. I think in Melbourne we're seeing zoysia a little bit more often now. But they're generally going to require less mowing and be a bit more drought tolerant as well. Okay, so I think I need to just unshare my screen to see if we've got questions. So I'll do that for just a moment. And if you do have questions, pop them in the chat. I think I can see. Oh, excuse me. I'm just going to try to get that up. Okay, let's see what we've got. Is there anything I can do about my neighbour's large clistemons? I'm very sucking all the moisture. This is a bit of an issue. So planting under eucalypts and big trees taking moisture, really it depends on the size of the tree a little bit. Sometimes growing actually in pots or raised garden beds around those areas can sometimes be the only option to get gardens going. The other thing to do would be really looking at very drought tolerant ground covers like a Myoporum or a creeping Boobiella or something that would naturally grow under a large callistemon or eucalypt. But the soil is generally always going to be a bit drier under big trees. So in terms of planting under them, it's really us changing what we want to grow under there sometimes, rather than trying to add. Generally, if you add a lot of moisture, it's just going to get sucked up. However, you can do things like mulching, and I think when we talk about mulch, I'll talk about a living mulch, which is just a ground cover. And I think that's a really good option for under those big trees. Do we have we have a desalination plant. I've got no idea if it's operating or not. Oh, here we go. It can provide up to 1/3 of Melbourne's water. Yeah, I'm not actually sure whether how often it operates or how much water it provides. I'm sorry. Um, Chrissy, the question about bark on a vegetable patch, I'm going to answer just when we talk about mulch. So I'll just park that one for a minute. Improving water infiltration on a compacted surface. Okay. So if you've got soil compaction, this is generally where the soil is really hard, difficult to dig, and often if you do water, the water's just going to run off the surface instead of soaking in. Generally, in the long term, organic matter is what you need because then you will have worms, and earthworms are going to do a lot of the job there. They're going to do a lot of the work for you. Michael, I like your idea. Apply compost as a mulch. Yes, it will, compost or any organic matter will break down and it will improve the structure of your soil. Um, in the short term, we don't really recommend digging over your whole veggie patch like we used to get that English tradition of double digging and digging big trenches and turning all the soil over. However, it's fine if you need to get a garden fork and just put that into the surface, into your soil and give it a bit of a wiggle around, and maybe then add some compost. That can help. The other thing that I've done, I've got really, really heavy clay where I live, is grow a whole heap of daikon radishes. They grow pretty quickly and they will break up that soil surface really nicely. And then if you want to, you can actually just cut them off a little bit below soil level and let them decompose in the soil. So they will break up that compacted soil, as well as adding organic matter at the same time. So that's what we call like a green manure. And for compacted soils, I always recommend having one that includes daikon radish. I've been absolutely amazed at how strong those roots are. They will penetrate into super, super heavy soil. Hopefully that's given you enough ideas. I guess I should say there's a difference between compacted soil and just having hydrophobic soil. So your soil can be quite sandy and not compacted and still have water run off the surface. And that's what we call hydrophobic, where your soil actually becomes a bit repellent to water. And in that case, just gently raking over the surface can break up that soil, particularly if you've got sandy soil. Sometimes it's just like a crust on the surface. But if that doesn't work, sometimes you can get soil wetters that will break up that kind of surface tension that is stopping the water penetrate. You need to be a little bit careful. They are generally derived from petrochemicals, and some of them aren't great for our aquatic animals. So there are some homemade ones you can use with just essentially a little bit of detergent. Okay, let's see what I have. Troubles digging and turning over compost. That's okay. Black compost in space of fruit trees. Yep. Compost from the kitchen in these bins. Oh, sorry, I've lost your question. Cover with shredded paper. Throw a bucket of water on top. Rotate them around. The improvement and health of these fruit trees have been wonderful. So that's a great idea. So essentially, what you're doing is, without having to lift compost, you're actually moving your compost bins from place to place. At the base of a fruit tree is a great place to put that because all of the nutrients are going to go down into be feeding your fruit trees. So yeah, I guess for that system to work, I quite like that idea. All you would need is several of the bins because obviously you need to wait until the compost is, mature enough to be able to move it around that way. But that's a really nice idea to get organic matter into your soil, into your garden. What do I think about liquid preparations? Oh, this is such a big area. There are a lot of products around that are, they always say they're teeming with microbes, contain all the things your soil needs, and all of those sort of things. Yeah, probiotics, lots of those things. I'll give you an opinion on them. I couldn't give you an assessment of all of those products. But what I think generally is if you're focusing on your soil health all the time, making your own compost, and mulching, you probably don't need the extra probiotics, and things. I guess you need to think about if you're adding all those little living organisms to your soil, there's only so much food for them going around. And what we want is a really, really healthy soil food web and kind of soil culture and habitat that is in balance. So for me, I would tend to focus more on the compost and mulch and take a slow and steady approach. Um, However, I guess if you're just starting a garden, if you've got some real problems with your soil, if you can see that, it's going to take a while to build those up, they're probably not going to do a lot of harm to you for you. The only thing I would be a bit conscious of is that a lot of them, if they're in a liquid form, they'll be dissolved in a salty solution, and that salty solution, may not be great to use over and over again. So yeah, I can't say I'm an expert on what's in all of them, um, but yeah, that would be my opinion. Okay, is there an organic way to replace lawn without weed killer? I'm afraid of using chemicals. Any ground cover you can recommend that can outcompete and replace the grass. Okay. For a start, if you've got buffalo grass, it's possible to remove it with a spade because it's not super invasive. You can just essentially get your spade and kind of lift it up little bit by little bit, and remove it that way. The other thing you can do is what's called sheet mulching, and that is putting layers of cardboard down over the lawn. You generally mow your lawn as short as possible first. And if you can do it on a stinking hot day, it's great because then your lawn is already a bit stressed by the time you try to kill it. So nature's kind of done half the job for you. Mow it really short, put some wet cardboard or layers of newspaper on top. Make sure there are no gaps, so overlap the layers. And then you can mulch on top. You want to wet the newspaper or cardboard, and hopefully that will smother the grass underneath. Some grasses like kikuyu and maybe buffalo, because they have rhizomes, you may need to have a couple of goes, or you might find there's still a little bit living. But that's what I would be doing to do a chemical-free approach to getting rid of the lawn. Knowing how much to water, we're about to dive into that. So let's get going with the rest. Hopefully I can share my screen again. Excellent. All right. Keep adding your questions because we'll come back at the end. I hope we'll have time. Okay, so let's talk about mulch and that question about which mulch to put on veggie gardens and other gardens. So first, just as an overview, what mulching does is it kind of protects your soil. It's like putting a bit of a protective blanket over your soil. It's going to keep a lot of water in. It reduces the amount of evaporation, so it helps keep your soil moist. It can help suppress weeds, which is excellent. No one loves spending hours pulling weeds out. Um, as it breaks down, if it's an organic mulch, it will add nutrients to your soil just gradually, and that will improve the soil structure as well. But importantly, mulch also can help reduce soil compaction. So when you're stepping on it, again, it's like a little bit of protection, bit of insulation there. And it can help reduce runoff and erosion. And as we get really dry days, erosion through wind or runoff through an erosion through really heavy rain also can be an issue. So we want to keep our soil in our garden. So mulch is really good there. And it can help regulate the soil temperature. That's really good for all the soil food web that's living in there. And in its own right, it provides a little bit of habitat. Insects and lizards, and yes, also snails and slugs sometimes too. In terms of the types of mulch, so we generally look at a woody mulch or a straw-based mulch. I've got a couple of examples of woody mulches there. One is very, very chunky. This is sometimes called arborist's mulch, and it's essentially just, shredded trees from an arborist. You can see that it's going to have really big gaps between all the pieces, so water's going to flow through it really easily. It's going to have lots of air in there. You might think that's not going to suppress weeds, but these mulches do suppress weeds about the same as a finer bark mulch, and stop evaporation as well. And the really good thing about these is they're very slow to break down. So you'd only need to top them up maybe every 2 years. The fine bark mulch is essentially the same, but it probably looks a little bit better and neater on your garden, and it's going to break down a bit faster. With this one, you do need to be a little bit more careful of not putting it right up against the trunks of your trees, for the risk of what we call collar rot, which is a fungal disease that's going to, rot your trees, because that fine bark mulch holds a little bit more moisture. And then this one, which is just a mix of wood chips and, leaves and things. Probably the big benefit of this is it's probably pretty cheap. If you can find an arborist doing some work in your street or in your neighborhood, they might drop it off for free for you. It's going to break down fairly quickly. And this is really lovely for Indigenous gardens because it's got that mix of all sorts of different materials that might actually provide some good habitat. In terms of veggie gardens, though, a wood mulch is going to be very heavy, so seeds aren't going to be able to come up through that mulch and push pieces aside, and even seedlings can kind of struggle in that wood mulch. And wood mulch can also draw a bit of nitrogen out of the soil as it breaks down. So we recommend a straw-based mulch for a veggie garden. This might be pea straw, lucerne, sugarcane mulch. And we recommend this for veggie gardens and annual flowers. As I said at the beginning, they're hungry, fast-growing plants. So this mulch that's breaking down quickly is adding a bit more nutrient. Bacteria is really active in breaking it down. Which one you choose is really up to you. They each have slight advantages and disadvantages. So sugarcane mulch, if we're buying it in Victoria, it's got a long way to travel, so it's got some kind of travel emissions associated with it. Pea straw mulch, I find, can be a little bit fine. I find it's a little bit fine and can sort of blow away sometimes. I really like lucerne. It's a little bit higher in nitrogen, but it can be harder to find. You probably need to go to a landscape yard and buy a bale of it. So that's what we recommend, just any of those straw-based mulches for veggie gardens. The other thing you can think about is having a living mulch. So I've got a few examples here of native ground covers. If you're after one that is just tough as boots, I'd recommend this, Creeping Boobiella. It would survive on very little water at all, and will spread fairly quickly, maybe a little bit too quickly, hard to say. The disadvantage of this, it's not really a lawn substitute, because the stems are quite woody. So if you're walking on it, you will snap bits off. If you're looking for a lawn substitute, the two at the bottom I'd recommend there. How to apply the mulch? Make sure it's either just been raining, or you've watered your garden beds well. You want them to be wet when they start. And then generally about 5 centimetre layer is a good indication. You can do a little bit less for bark, a little bit more for straw, if you want to. If you've got lots of weeds, do that sheet mulching process that I mentioned before. Put some paper or cardboard down. And I guess don't necessarily think that more mulch is better. So if you've got a great big mound of it near a tree you've just planted, or a big, big layer in your veggie patch, all it's going to do when it rains is the rain is actually not going to make it all the way down to your soil and your plant roots. Okay, let's talk about actually water storage, and reuse, and then we'll talk about watering, which is the actual putting water in the garden. So in terms of where your water's coming from, it might be coming from rainwater, and you might be catching it off your roofs or other hard surfaces. Or you can look at water that is coming from your house that you've already used in your house, and having what we call a grey water system. And for each of these, what I'd say is there are very simple DIY options up to absolutely very expensive options that you'd need to have professionally installed. So I'll try and give you ideas for both. In terms of rainwater tanks and grey water, it's a really good idea to check with your local council as to whether you need permission. So I know in my council area, we don't technically need permission to put a rainwater tank in, but we do need permission to put, for example, a concrete slab or structure to put the tank on, which means that you need a permit to put a rainwater tank in. For grey water, generally, if the water is released directly into the garden, like from your washing machine, you may not need a permit. But if you've got a system that stores water and filters it, then you may well need to get a permit. So it's worth checking for both of those. So I've got a few options of rainwater capture here. This one, which is Angelo from Deep Green Permaculture set up, is just a series of repurposed olive barrels. I think he started with one, and then he worked out how to link them all together. I think each one of these is 500 litres at, I think. So he's actually, or maybe it's 250, it must be. He's actually ended up with more than 1,000 litres of water, and essentially a rainwater tank for just the cost of all the fittings. The other three options are options you'd buy. So this one is a bladder system that can go under a deck. And it can be really good. It doesn't you don't necessarily see it in your garden. It doesn't take up garden space if you have, a deck or veranda at your place. The other one's just a slimline corrugated tank, and then a poly tank. They're the main options. You can look at an underground tank, but it's pretty costly to put that in. In terms of looking at the size of your tank and things, you want to do a bit of research. So each of the materials, the corrugated iron versus the poly, will have advantages and disadvantages. They'll have different costs, and things. But generally, you want to make sure you can get to your tank. They're not totally maintenance free. You want to be able to check it and make sure that it's operating the way it can be, and sometimes to check the level. Installing them on the shady side of your house can be good, because they're all affected by UV light. So having light on the fittings and things will mean they wear out more quickly. For all of these, you do need an overflow connection. So if you get too much rain and the tank fills up, you do not want it to be overflowing, especially if it's near your building, your house or any other buildings. So you'd be looking at getting a plumber to do the installation for you and make sure that you've got the overflow discharging into stormwater somewhere. The other thing to consider is whether you want a first flush diverter. And what these are, you can see here, it's like a little trap, and it traps the first, usually maybe 150 litres of water, and doesn't put that into your tank, and then the rest will flow into your tank. And that first bit of water tends to be quite dirty. It's got all of the dust and particulates and pollution that's been sitting on your roof. And if it hasn't rained for a while, that can be quite a lot. So it helps to keep the water clean, and helps to make sure that your tank doesn't fill up with silt to have that. And then it's worth noting as well that you can use your rainwater tanks to connect to flush toilets. In terms of tank size, generally the bigger the better. As a gardener, you want to have lots of water. However, you need it to be reasonable and you need to be able to afford it. So I recommend looking at this Tankulator website, and you can actually type in what you're going to use the water for. Is it how big's your garden? How big's your roof? And it will give you some guidance as to what sort of size rainwater tank will be good for you. It looks at your climate as well, how many days of rain you get, how many days no rain you're likely to get. And then the other thing with rainwater tanks you need to think about is actually how to get the water out of them. So sometimes you can use gravity. That's what I use at my place. Obviously, if you've got the tank at the top of a hill and your garden's at the bottom, that would be ideal. But in Melbourne, we tend to have flatter types of gardens generally. So what you would find is if you're using gravity, when the tank is full, you've got great water pressure. And as the tank empties, the water pressure becomes less and less. So I've said gravity feed is suitable for soaker hoses, and they're the hoses that you can attach and the water just dribbles out of them. For low pressure drip line systems, it's possible to use gravity. I know on my tank, it probably wouldn't have the pressure to support a drip system. So in that case, if I wanted to use that for a drip irrigation system, I would be looking at a pump. They'll increase the water pressure. However, you do need a power source. If you're using your rainwater to flush your toilets, you'll need a pump because you need to have that water pressure charged all the time. The other thing I'd really urge you to do if you have a water tank is to use the water in it. I can't tell you how many gardens I've been to, particularly when I used to do garden maintenance, where people had tanks and then for one reason or another, they just didn't use the water. They found the tap still more convenient. And it seems silly. You're saving all this rainwater for a rainy day. If you think about it, if your tank's full and it rains, you actually have no capacity to store any of that rainfall. So having a tank is great, but please use the water. So there is an idea called water banking, or some people call it the leaky hose system, where you actually do gradually use the water and you make sure that when rain is predicted, your tank's at least half empty so you can capture that. And if you're generally putting water gradually into your soil is going to be storing the water for you. Okay, in terms of grey water, so this is really recycling any household wastewater for use on garden beds. It can be a really good way of saving water. I'm sure a lot of us did it during the last drought when we had buckets in our shower and we were carrying them out to the garden when we weren't allowed to use hoses. We generally divide household water up into two types. Grey water, which is a bit dirty, but not too dirty. So this would be water from your shower and from your laundry. And then black water. And this is water that is really full of contaminants and soil or, human waste that we don't want to come into contact with. So this would be toilet water and our kitchen water technically. And if you have a look at this graph, you'll see that most of the water we use is actually in our bathrooms, in our shower and hand basins. So if you're looking for one thing to connect up to grey water, your shower or bath is an obvious place to look. As I said, there are DIY solutions. So yes, a bucket. When I get veggies from my garden, I always have a bucket of water outside and I do my first rinse of them to get all the soil off outside. And I kind of consider that grey water usage. Then I just throw that bucket on my garden and I also don't put my soil down the drain. You can also get these grey water hoses. You connect this to your washing machine, maybe just for the rinse cycle. And it's got really big kind of slots in it. So you can connect that and take it out the back door and then put it around your fruit trees and put that water onto your trees that way. Or you can get something really professional like this. You'd have to have this installed by a plumber. And this is a much more sophisticated way of using grey water. It gets the grey water. Here you'd usually have an on-off sort of switch, so you don't have to have it operating all the time. But you can see the water goes through a whole heap of filters of gravel and sand and charcoal. So it comes out a lot cleaner. There's a picture of a storage tank there, but generally the water is stored for only a few hours, usually no more than 24 hours. So it might all go through the filter until it's all there and then it'll get pumped out onto your garden. So that's a much more sophisticated kind of setup. There are a few safety considerations for grey water just because there's a risk of grey water containing bacteria or, as I said, some human waste that can be really harmful to our health. So we don't recommend using it on veggies or herbs. Anything that it comes into contact with, you want it not to then eat it. You don't want to have kids playing in it or pets drinking your grey water. Or to use it for spray irrigation, to actually be spraying it around in the atmosphere. So you'd usually use like a porous hose, a soaker hose or something, or an irrigation system that is actually on the ground level. You can use grey water for fruit trees, but you need to be choosing your detergents really carefully, just to make sure that they're not putting a lot of chemicals and particularly phosphorus onto your plants, which can be quite damaging, particularly for native plants and proteas. So you'd be looking at, trying to get the cleanest water you can from your household water. And that's why we say generally rinse water's best for the washing machine. You'd sort of do your soapy water down the drain and then you put your rinse water with less of the chemical in it onto your garden. And in terms of watering your plants, so even if you've been really careful with detergents, that water is likely to be a little bit salty and have a little bit of phosphorus in it. So every now and again, you either want to be moving your grey water hose around a lot, or every now and again turning the system off and just using fresh water, as kind of flush all of those things out of your soil. That's really good for your plant health then. Just quickly, I'm just going to touch on these. A few other things you could think about would be rain gardens. This is a garden where your downpipe empties into the garden. They're generally full of quite sandy soil. And again, it's like a bit of a bathtub full of sand. They'd fill up with water, but then drain gradually away. And keeping those plants alive at the same time, and filtering the water and making sure it's nice and clean. And then you can actually have a series of these where they go from one rain garden to another, and eventually having an overflow or an outflow into the stormwater. The other thing you can do is what's called a downpipe diversion. And this sort of captures just that incidental like dew that's accumulated on your roof overnight. You can get a bit of water every day from something like that. Okay. I'm going to go through water use and hopefully we'll have 10 minutes at the end for questions. So this is really, how are you going to water? How do you know how often to water? Um, and there are some kind of golden rules that gardeners go by. So you don't want to be watering on your plants themselves or the plant leaves. You want to water where the water is going to be used, which is the roots of the plant. So if you are watering, we want water to go at ground level and down into the soil so that the plant roots can take that water up. It's generally better to do it in the morning. Plants are going to be more active during the day and they're going to be using more water and taking more up during the day. If you're watering at night, it sort of increases the potential for fungal growth and things as well. The rule for garden beds, so actually watering in your soil, is to water more thoroughly but less often. So this idea of encouraging deep watering and deep root growth and more robust plants by doing that. And that can increase drought tolerance. For your containers and pots, however, if you water really deeply, lots of water is going to come out of the drainage holes at the bottom, and it's probably going to take some nutrients with it, and you're really wasting water. So for containers and pots, we sort of say you need water more sparingly, but because of that, you'll need to water more often. And for containers and pots, particularly in summer, a little saucer at the bottom, just a very shallow one, can help you catch some of that water rather than wasting it. Your watering technology does not have to be super sophisticated or super expensive. These moisture probes are quite accurate and they can help you determine when it's time to water. I just tend to use my finger as my most useful tool. And I scratch away the mulch, put my finger into the soil, and you can see if it's still fairly moist, a third of a finger, put it down to my second knuckle, I guess. If I can feel moisture down there, I probably won't water. If it feels dry that far down, probably 5 centimeters down into the soil, then it's time to water. Or having timers is really great if you've got soaker hoses and things, just so you make sure you're not leaving them on for hours and forgetting them and wasting water that way. For pots, these water spikes can be okay. I tend to find they don't have a great that controlling the flow of water is really difficult. So there are a few other things around that you can try, like the terracotta spikes that you can drip water into, and they'll let water come out really gradually. And then even having a trigger nozzle on your hose, you might not even think of that as watering technology, but it means that you can adjust the water and just, water what you want to, and not too much as well. However, let's look at other irrigation methods. So generally, when we're talking about irrigating, we can do that from above, like hand holding a hose or having a sprinkler, at the surface, like a drip system, or from below, which is like a wicking bed. In terms of watering by hand, unfortunately, it's a really inefficient way to water the garden. I say unfortunately because I think it's a great way to meet your neighbours and say hi to people. But we're terrible judges at watering. We tend to water a lot too much with the hose and quite unevenly. You can test this. You can set up a little grid of paper cups 1 metre apart, and then you can try and water all of them and fill each of them up, and you'll see how difficult it is for you to water really, really evenly. So we also lose water this way through watering paths and driveways, watering fences, evaporation, and wind blowing the water off. So watering by hand is not a super efficient way of watering. Similar with sprinklers, we tend to lose quite a bit of water through evaporation. And as you can see, you're watering the whole soil level, but often really not very deeply. And this poor plant here is actually losing out on a lot of water because the sprinkler's going up and over it. So again, if you did your little matrix of paper cups, you'd probably find that your sprinkler is not a very efficient way of evenly watering an area. I know that you can get sprinklers that wobble now, and they will avoid this issue. This plant would get some, but you'll still get spray drift and evaporation. Um, if we look at watering at level, drip systems and drip applications are quite efficient. They're putting water exactly where you want it, which is just into the soil. And as long as you leave them on for long enough, you will get quite deep watering and deep root growth. And of course, you can just put your drip systems where the plants are so that the area in between plants isn't getting a lot of water. So that's what we consider a really efficient way of watering. Um, Similarly, watering from below is a really efficient way to water. So these are examples of self-watering pots. This one, it's a bit hard to see because the plants are in the way. So it's got an inlet pipe here, and a water reservoir at the bottom. And then for this one, the water comes up through this bit of perlite through the leg and into the soil. This is a system you can use that actually retrofits a pot and turns it into a something like a wicking bed. So you pop the water in, it's held here, and then any overflow in this one just goes out and down out the drainage holes the way that it would in a normal pot. So with these systems, you don't get a lot of evaporation, and they're quite good because you can go on holidays, you can go away for the weekend, and you know your plants have a water reservoir there ready to go. You can also do this on a larger scale. So this would be what's called a wicking bed. And actually the garden beds behind me, my ones are versions of these. But this is the same principle as a self-watering pot. You've got water coming in, you've got a reservoir at the bottom that's going to hold a lot of water, and then the water's actually going to come up, and you can sort of tell from that diagram that it's going to encourage these plants to grow really deep roots. They want to get down to where the water is. And importantly, you just don't lose a lot from evaporation. In fact, you can quite often get a bit of a crust on the top of the soil. It can feel quite dry. But when you do your finger test and dig down, you'll find the water's moist underneath and there's water there for your plants. For all of these options, you do need some kind of an overflow to make sure that when it really rains, you're not making a bathtub and drowning all your plants in them. Okay, before we finish, I'm going to zip through very quickly, and this is in your notes, I think, just what to do on very hot days and then also after lots of rain, before and after lots of rain. So in a super hot day, we'd want to be watering. So we want to be filling up wicking beds and self-watering pots, watering deeply in the morning or even the night before if you aren't going to have time in the morning. Making sure the soil's covered in mulch. And then you might be doing things like moving your pots into the shade or grouping them all together so that they're shading each other a little bit. And putting a bit of shade over some vulnerable plants if you can. So having a sheet or I think people now are making much more semi-permanent shade structures for these sort of days that you can move around and install. Most importantly, look after yourself. Don't go out in the middle of the day, even if you do see your plants wilting, and spend hours and hours trying to take care of them. It's really likely on a super hot day that your plants have essentially shut down. They've kind of closed their stomata. They're wilting to stop themselves losing any more water. And there's not a lot of point watering them at that time. After the heat event, you want to rehydrate everything. So again, a nice deep watering. If your pots have dried out, actually putting the whole thing in a bucket of water can be really good. Just leave it there for 5 minutes or so. You'll see lots of bubbles come up. That's a sign that the water's kind of getting into the potting mix, and then take them out and let them drain properly. And if you've had lots of damage to your plants, like burnt leaves and things, if you can bear to, leave them on the plant. If you go and prune them all off, you're going to encourage some new growth. And then if you get another super hot day, that new growth is really delicate and vulnerable. So if you can bear to leave any burnt leaves until kind of early autumn, it will actually be better for the plant. Similarly, for rain events, you kind of want to do the opposite. You want to make sure you don't have water stored all over the place. So make sure that your gutters and tank inlets are clean so you can collect water. Maybe empty part or all of your rainwater tank, depending on how much you trust the weather forecast. You might want to give all your water or just some of it. You might want to turn off your grey water so that you're not adding a big rain event plus grey water to your garden. And then importantly, just check some of your fruit trees and things and make sure mulch isn't right up against the stems and the trunks, because once that mulch gets wet, that's when you can get some rotting, collar rot and fungal diseases and things. After the rain, it's a good idea to stay out of your garden for a while. If you walk on the waterlogged soil, it's likely to compact it a bit. So if you can bear to stop and just let it drain away a bit and dry out a little bit, it's good. You probably want to empty sources, particularly make sure there's nowhere that mosquitoes are going to breed. And then the main risk after a lot of rain is the risk of fungal disease. And so having airflow is really good. So you might want to even do a little bit of pruning once your plants have dried out, just to make sure that they're not super crowded, and that you've got lots of air there. And then, of course, you're going to get lots of weeds and snails. And yeah, you can just spend a bit of time keeping on top of those. And be aware that if we do get lots of rainfall, each time it rains, a little bit of the nutrients in your soil are being washed down. So particularly if you have sandy soil, you may want to do some fertilizing, some of that aged animal manure and topping up your compost. Okay, so I think we've gone through this using enough water, trying not to waste it, really valuing it, and having a think about how you design and zone your garden, so that you can still grow the things you want to, with the water that you do have, but that you're sort of prepared for a bit of a hotter, drier future. Okay, we've got just a couple of minutes for questions, so let's see what we can get through. I hope there's lots there. I might start from the
Well,
bottom if that's okay.
while you're answering questions, I might just put up our feedback slide because we
Oh, yeah,
love your
perfect.
feedback and it's very important to our program. So if you enjoyed tonight's session, or perhaps if you want to tell us why, but I'm sure that you did, you can use this QR code now to give us some feedback. And thanks in advance for that.
Yeah, fabulous. Okay. Everyone get into that and I'll see if I can answer these. So a couple of questions about Oyas, spelled Ollah. So what an Oya is a terracotta vessel. I think it's a traditional South American way of watering. And terracotta, of course, is porous. So what you would do with this vessel, looks a bit like a water bottle, is you'd bury it in your garden in the soil, and it'll have a little spout at the top, or a little what am I thinking of? Neck at the top where you can fill it up with water, and then because terracotta is porous, the water will gradually come out of that, and it's a really nice way of just gradually watering your garden. They are quite expensive. So the place I know that sells them, I think, is a mail order one up on the rooftop. I don't know if there are others around. But they are a nice alternative to like a wicking bed. And I guess you don't need to do much retrofitting. You're just digging a bit of soil out and burying the Oya. You can, if you Google, there are ways of making your own from two terracotta pots and using, I think, silicone to seal up between them, and one you seal up the bottom drainage hole, and then you just put your water into the top drainage hole. So that may be a less expensive way to get that. And they are effective. The only thing I'd recommend is not growing mint near them because the mint roots will totally surround your Oya and it'll look like something out of Stranger Things. Okay, terracotta Oya pots. Yeah, worthwhile. Yes, people have used them, found them good spreading roots. Yeah, I guess that's a good point. So the water from the Oya is going to be quite localized. It's not going to be like having a wicking bed where there's water under every bit of soil. So yeah, probably plants with fibrous root systems. I think you're right. Liz would be good. Doesn't water from the laundry add saline? Yes, it does. So that's the reason that, oh, sorry. So it doesn't water from the laundry add saline to the soil. That is the reason why I would say don't use that laundry water over and over and over on the same place. Either move your hose around or water a couple of times with the laundry water and then water with, rainwater or tap water because you do risk building salt building up in your soil. So you need to be a bit aware of like spreading that water around as much as you can. And I think we're back to where we were, which is how do you, yeah, too much water, not too much, but just enough. So I think using your finger or a water meter before you water is probably the main way. So you're not watering unnecessarily. In terms of knowing how much, really a good what I would recommend is watering, however you do it, hose or with your irrigation system. Water for however long you think you need to water, and then do an investigation. So pull the mulch back and dig a little bit in your garden. Dig, just with a trowel, just dig a little bit down and see how much water has actually got in there and how deep it's gone. So you might need to do that a few times. But I've done that and been really surprised at the fact that water hasn't gone into the soil very much. I've thought I've put heaps on and it's only, 3 centimeters deep, really not deep enough for big, deep root growth. And then other times I think I've watered and it's, been like a full spade's depth of water. And that's essentially all you need. Once you've got that water down to 15 to 20 centimeters, it's going to hopefully continue to go down a bit deeper into the soil. Some will evaporate off the top, but you're likely to get to most of your root system that way. Remembering that almost all roots are within the first, like the top 60 centimeters of soil. And for veggies, they're probably within the first 25 to 30 centimeters. So you don't need to be watering like a meter deep, especially for veggies. You just need to go so deep. Okay, let me just look at some new ones. Oh yeah, thanks. Thank you for that. DIY Oya pot. Um, Elaborate on French drains. Okay, I'll do this, but very quickly because we're running out of time. So a French drain is essentially a trench, and it's a trench that then gets filled with gravel. And I'm not sure why it's called a French drain. I guess they use them quite a lot, but it can be a way of storing a bit of water a little bit deeper than and capturing a little bit more rainwater. The places I've seen them used have been, for example, next to a path. So you might have a path that drains into a garden bed and you might dig a French drain next to it. It would be about 20 centimeters deep, 15 or 20 centimeters deep, filled with gravel. And the idea is then you're capturing that water and stopping it going other places. You generally don't plant into the French drain. You would generally just use it as a kind of water storage area and to stop some runoff, I guess. But that's the principle of it. In terms of the ins and outs of like whether you need overflows and things, I think you need to do a little bit of your own research. I'm kind of at the end of my knowledge with that one. Okay, so we've run out of time and I think run out of questions too. So thank you all for your attention and it's been lovely presenting to you. Lots of good questions, which I love. And I'll just see, Kat, is there anything else that you need to need people to do? I'm assuming everyone's done their feedback.
No, all good. I'm just going to encourage you to go to mysmartgarden.org.au and have a look at some of the other free events and workshops and resources that we've got on offer. And we look forward to seeing you in 2026. So have a lovely, restful, safe, peaceful, fun summer, everybody, and we'll see you back here. I hope your tomatoes thrive.
Yeah, me too. Yes. If you can get tomatoes by Christmas, you're doing super well. All
Especially this
right.
year.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Good night.